fair one.
Well, hello there and welcome to what is the second edition of the Frasers Perspective podcast. My name's Daniel Goodfellow. I'm hosting a series of conversations with people from the Frasers Property Australia business. And today I'm joined by Anthony Boyd, who's the Executive General Manager of Residential for Frasers Property. Anthony, hello.
Hi, Daniel.
So this is a very strange experience for us because we know each other quite well.
Correct.
But we're sitting here in a sound booth and it's all very formal and we're going to have a conversation.
It's great. I'm looking forward to it.
So I guess as a starting point, I'd love to hear a bit about you and your history because you haven't always been in property. This is in some ways a place you've arrived at
that's right.
through a journey. So tell us about what you've been doing.
Yeah, that's right. I started in the finance industry actually, and I am qualified in that space, but I thought almost immediately starting out in that area that I probably didn't want to stay in there. So I spent a bit of time doing that, both here and overseas, and then moved into more commercial, more I guess, property-focused stuff when I got back to Australia after spending some time in Asia. And then I've been at Frasers now for over 13 years and more recently in this role as the head of the residential business, which is a fantastic role.
Yeah. What does it feel like to because one of the things that obviously you do throughout the year is from time to time you would go to a site somewhere in Australia that could be a big empty paddock. It could have a factory on it. It could be, an unused bit of land next to a river somewhere. And you're there with the team thinking, could we do something here? What does that feel like? Like, tell us about that experience of looking at a place and going, I wonder what's possible.
Yeah, it is amazing, especially in cities that you know. So there's areas of cities that require redevelopment, and some that you don't necessarily see it the minute you walk there. But the beauty of my role is that I've got some fantastic people in the team that can have a vision for these places well before, even the planners understand that. And I think that's the beauty of what we do is actually being able to put your fingerprints on that and have some aspiration, I guess, in terms of what it might mean to the people that might live there sometime down the road.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess so much of what you do and the team that you work with do is right at the centre of this big transition going on in Australia at the moment, right? Where the quarter-acre block of yesteryear is still a reality and possible in some areas of the country, but is fast becoming, less than the norm. And there's this adjustment going on, right, in that people are getting used to and sometimes embracing and, this kind of medium and higher density living. How do you see this concept of the Australian dream in 2018?
It's a really good question because I think we're in this evolution, as you suggest. There has always been the great Australian dream of owning property, and I think it's as strong as ever. It really is just an evolution of that, and it's still an aspiration. People still aspire to own property in Australia. And if you look at the way our cities are designed, there's a mix now. You do have an option where that previously was the urban sprawl giving you a quarter-acre block with a house and a picket fence. Yeah. You now have options. There is higher density development closer to the city. There is still that urban fringe development. And I guess what you have is a question, and some of that is defined by infrastructure and amenity as much as it is by price. But really there's different drivers for different people. And I think the consistent theme that goes all the way back in time and will go all the way out into the future is not just about the bricks and mortar. It's about really the great Australian dream, as far as I see it, is about belonging.
Yeah.
And really feeling like you're part of a happy and healthy community.
And that's the thing, isn't it, that those communities can take different forms and it can be sprawling streets of houses that are all separate from one another. It can be a tall building. But what's interesting about it is that different people have different attitudes towards those different ways of living. And I think the interesting thing is to what extent, particularly in the big cities, as you fly over them now, you can still see there are these pockets of homes sitting there and you go, I don't know that they're going to be there in 20 years' time as they get more dense. And, people have differing views on that. And where do you stand? Like, what's your view on how particularly Melbourne and Sydney should develop in order to be successful?
Yeah, I think it is about diversity. Ironically, I don't think we will be ever in the position where cities evolve at all the same rate across every single suburb. And I also think there is flexibility. That's good design, and it's actually good for the community to be able to move at different paces depending on where you are. I think the really interesting piece in all of this is that we're actually living in an age now where, ironically, due to the high intensity of social media and those sort of things, I think it feels like there's more connection.
Yeah.
But in fact, if you really look into it, I think social media is probably driving actually more disconnection. And so I think that the real essence of good development and good city building going forward will be about how you generate that connection at a real human scale.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of conversations about people almost reminiscing about their childhood and thinking about probably simpler times, right? Around there weren't smartphones and there wasn't that intensity of life, I guess. And what they lament is that lack of connection in the neighbourhood and then almost in the street. So what you're explaining, I think, will always be the essence of what makes a good community and a good development and a good city is that real human connection with what is immediately around you in that street you live in.
So this is the thing I always find so fascinating, because the average guy on the street, if you said to them, what do developers think about this concept of community? They'd probably say developers couldn't give two hoots about it. All they want to do is grab a bit of land, put a building on it, make as much money as possible, and then get the hell out of town. Whereas you and I both know that's just not the case. And I'd just love to hear your view on this. And firstly, why do we see developers in that light? But most importantly, what is it that you guys are doing and Frasers are doing to kind of create those community connections in an enduring way?
Yeah, I think this is the essence of what I'd hope we do well. I'd like to think we do reasonably well, but of course you can always do it better. I guess when you go back to the principles of this, property is about emotion. When you buy a house, you buy an apartment, residential property it's very emotional. And I think when you look at those fears, the frustrations, the desires that people have during that process, I think they're often only superficially addressed by developers. And what actually happens is post the marketing phase, customers are left feeling quite lonely or that they're by themselves because that dream that they were sold doesn't necessarily eventuate the way they thought it might. And to be honest, some developers do the wrong thing. They do overpromise and they do underdeliver. Yeah. And that could be anywhere from the quality of the dwelling itself all the way through to landscaping and just the building of that community. I think the reality is if you are focused on profit as a developer and that's all you really think about it, of course the customer does take a back seat and you can often erode that goodwill. But where Frasers has really positioned itself and the way that we've really, I guess, encompassed this idea of community and about that, the customer is what we call live proud. That's really the driving principle of the business. And the way I guess we could describe it is working backwards from what that actually means to someone. What does it mean to live proud? And what can we do to set out on that journey to make that position the right thing for the customer to be in at a point in time in the future, not going forward from a point of saying what can we do under planning or what can we do with our budget. We sort of work backwards from that idea of everything is about the customer and what it's like to live. How will they live? How will they communicate? How will they move in and around that neighbourhood? And I guess the principle that sits behind Live Proud is that every decision we make should be thinking about that customer experience. And the other thing I use quite often is that there's no role in our business that can depart from that. Everyone has an influence on that customer. Yeah.
What's it like to run a business that has such a diverse set of skills in it? So one of the things I've always noticed in observing Frasers is you've got, of course, people who are deeply creative because they're designers and master planners and they spend all day thinking about, the form of a building and the sculptural shape of things in a park. And then on the other hand, you've got people who need to make sure that everything happens on time and on a program. And then you've got finance. And unlike a lot of other businesses, these people often have to work together absolutely closely day to day.
That's right.
For you as a leader, how do you run such a diverse set of personalities?
Firstly, it's I completely understand that the people who work in our business are way better than me at a lot of these things. So as a leader, it's about almost just facilitating those discussions and facilitating that connection, I guess, between those different people. You're right, though. I can spend any given day or any given week varying in meetings between design and architecture conversations all the way through to marketing, landscaping, finance, banking, government relationships, and then a demographic analysis around how cities are moving and where population's shifting to, and then we can go into a conversation about planning and where the roads should be and how the infrastructure around electricity and water and all that sort of stuff comes into a site. So for me, it's all about engaging with those people that are experts in that field and then encouraging both autonomy and ownership of those ideas and giving people the rope, I guess, giving them the authority to make those decisions in the best interests of the project itself and the customers.
Yeah. Do you have when you think about this last few years that you've been in this role and it's been a big time in the business, are there projects that kind of really stick out to you as ones that you kind of look over and go, wow, I think we got that right?
For sure. I think there's always those projects that I think have a special place, because if you look at how you start out in these things, like you said before, often you're standing in a vacant field and picturing what these things might look like, and having a high level of aspiration or ambition around what it could be. So everywhere from Fairwater in Sydney and Blacktown, all the way up to Hamilton Reach in Brisbane, Port Coogee over in Perth. I mean, there's any number of examples that are very diverse, but when you look at the ideas that go into how we're designing these projects and how you make them really livable spaces for people, I think we've got a number of examples that you can prove that. Yeah.
What do you think about the way our cities are developing? So, if we sort of take a step back from Frasers broadly, if you were sitting in, I guess it's Scott Morrison's chair these days, what kinds of things do you think we need to be doing as a country to ensure that as the population increases that we can kind of manage this in a way that keeps cities livable?
Yeah. How long have we got for this podcast?
As long as you like.
We've got a few bigger issues there that we need to solve. But you're right. City planning is way more than just about housing. It's about employment. It's about leisure, education, transport. We really have to understand how people want to live, how they move around. And good planning really relies on that alignment between a number of different parties. Government have a huge influence on that, but the private sector does too. And that connection, whilst it seems quite simple, is actually really difficult to achieve well. But I think when you look at what people generally desire, that might be convenience, it might be safety, it might be connection. When you've got increased population, you run the risk of just having, without the benefit of that population, you have the risk of congestion and traffic and pressure on schools and hospitals, and people are time poor, and then naturally pressure on house prices. So what we need to do as a country is unlock these problems, obviously through better planning, but just better vision around how we think these cities can evolve, how you absorb more people into the existing cities. The footprints might need to get a little bit bigger. Obviously, infrastructure needs to get better. But planning it to the point where people feel like it is more structured rather than reactive around either things that just become broken or become too busy. But from my own real perspective, I think you still have to really think about it in terms of providing a variety of housing options for a variety of different people.
And that's the thing, is that there's a couple of things I want to pick up on that. The one thing is it does vary from state to state, So it's interesting to me that if you look at New South Wales, where the government has, in a couple of instances, built sort of brand new train stations before the people arrived, and obviously Frasers has a project at Edmondson Park. Yep, called Ed. Whereas in Melbourne, there's really none of that whatsoever. And interestingly, it always surprises me that some of the worst traffic problems that are emerging in cities are actually not in the dense inner city, but they're in outer suburbs where the only option people have is the car. So, there's this sort of it's a kind of catch-22, because the infrastructure is needed, but so too is that sort of mindset shift that these are going to be big, busy cities.
100%.
And I know you've lived in Hong Kong, I've lived in New York, and in both of those cities, no one bats an eyelid at the idea of having a family in an apartment, whereas for huge numbers of Australians, that's sort of this kind of brain snap, it makes no sense.
That's right.
So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
No, I think that's right. One of the challenges, I guess, you've got is exactly that. It's a mindset shift. And in reality, some of those, the world's greatest cities are often built around their public transport infrastructure.
Yeah.
How easy it is to get uptown, downtown, moving in and out of the city itself. And it's very rarely based on cars.
Yeah.
If you really look at those cities that you mentioned and some of the other really big cities in the world that function perfectly well, the reliance on cars is much lower, and also a lot of look at London, they have taxes to actually drive into the city, whereas in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, there is still that over-reliance on getting into a central business district, not having that satellite employment set up to the point where people can live and work and educate their kids in a sort of a smaller, call it 15-minute city or whatever you want to call it. We are still reliant on that influx into and that influx out of the cities every day.
Yeah. And it's funny. I mean, I know we don't want to sit and talk about politics for the next hour, but I was in Hong Kong this last weekend, and what struck me as we came in by train to the airport was the fact that the distance from the train carriage to the check-in was precisely the same distance as it was from the curb if you had arrived by car. And Melbourne, obviously, where I'm from, is every day we hear about some new plan for the airport rail. But I thought to myself, God, I could just imagine that in Melbourne, our rail will arrive at the other side of the service station, and you'll be dragging your suitcases like the Kerrigans in the castle,
That's right.
To get to the airport, and that's just not going to work. So
That's right.
It's kind of like, I think one of the fundamental principles about getting people to transition to that sort of public transport-oriented living is that you've got to be able to match the travel time as the car, or else people go, well, why would I?
Absolutely. And then you've got to add even something else. I mean, you look at some of those great public transport sort of transit stations. Often they're providing cafe options, restaurant options, fast food options, even entertainment options in a lot of cases. And they're the sort of things that I think we sometimes fall into a bad habit of trying to separate a little bit too much.
Yep.
And again, it all does come down to density and volume of traffic and those sorts of things. But I think if you have grander visions for what that might look like you're suggesting, then that's what you will achieve.
Yeah. It's interesting because obviously Frasers have a big variety of development types. There's the greenfields with land lots, and there's a number of very successful developments all over the country around that. But one of the sort of, I guess, types of sites that Frasers has been looking at more recently, like Discovery Point, like Ed, is this sort of transport-oriented, multi-use, retail plus resi. My goodness, that must be a big job to undertake.
Absolutely. But if you think about the fundamental drivers of why we think we can do those sorts of projects, it is about looking at these things through the lens of the customer.
Yeah.
So you go back to those first principles again. How do people want to get around the city? How predictable do commutes need to be? And I don't think people enjoy sitting in traffic in the car, right? Sometimes it's just the only choice they have. So you give them another choice, and you look at the demand. You're already seeing that come into these types of developments because people, they might be young couples, they might even be young families who are saying, I don't want 2 cars to be leaving the garage every day. Plus it's cost too.
Yeah.
But the convenience of having 2 cars leave every day and then drive home at the end of the day, I think if you give people the choice, they would prefer to say, I'm happy to walk down to the train station. It's right there. I can grab a coffee. I'm on the train. I'm 15 minutes into the office. That is much more. They're the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about much more, I think. And that's cities more generally. So we have the luxury, I guess, and I guess it's a responsibility to some degree, but it's a huge opportunity to do those projects of scale. But again, the cities are really going to be evolving that way as we move forward into the next few decades.
Yeah. And I mean, it obviously means that you and your team need people who have quite extraordinary capabilities, because just the sheer complexity of a site, and there's a number of them around the country, particularly in Sydney, you would say, that Frasers currently building, where you've got rail tunnels, where you've got, adjacent highways. And I mean, tell me about those kind of people in the business who are able to sit with a plan and actually work out in 3 dimensions how they're going to do it.
They're phenomenal. That's the bottom line. When you talk about the engineering of structure, so how do you have 30-story buildings sitting on top of tunnels? How do you have all of the infrastructure coming in and out of that, whether it's power, water, sewerage, that sort of stuff? I mean, that's phenomenal. So you've got to think about service provision. You've then got to think about how people move through them.
Yeah.
And so how, where are all your different weight transfers and all of those sort of things in terms of the volumes? And then the thing that I think is even more critical is then around how does a building actually evolve over time to be somewhere where people want to be.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to actually just design it and look at it on a piece of paper, but then you have to look at how does it sit within its surrounds? How does the architecture actually attract people to that site rather than move people away? There's obviously a huge amount of literature that talks about people's well-being.
Yeah.
And this is the other area that we could probably spend another half an hour podcast into. But you talk about the well-being of people. A huge amount of that has an influence of the environment that they're in. And so if you're thinking of those opportunities and thinking about what that actually does for people, then architecture, green space, open area, sunlight. So on top of all of those engineering challenges, you've then got all of those, I think they get bucketed into a bucket of sustainability, but really it's about well-being.
Exactly.
And how do you address those things? So you're right, some of these people are amazing the way they can hold these things together.
Well, we'll talk to them in detail in future episodes, no doubt. But I guess the final thing I want to sort of come back to and ask you about is this customer idea, because I know it's been your focus really for a couple of years now, and in that time, I think the business has come to sort of have a deeper understanding of what it is that's really driving people around property. And I think that's starting to kind of impact lots of different things in the business. But I'd love you to give me a sense, as you're around the business, meeting customers, seeing them at different events and things, what is it that you personally find the most meaningful when you observe those moments and realise that this is something that Frasers has played a part in?
There's no doubt it's the reality of these people's lives that you have in some way, and often in a great way, an influence over. And it's something that isn't lost on anybody who works for Frasers Property. I think that's the beauty of having a customer-focused strategy, is actually understanding the influence and the responsibility that comes with that you have on the way people live their lives. When you talk about the guiding principles of what we try to do, it's around design. It's around quality of the construction and the build of the dwellings themselves. It's around community development and the health of our residents. That's the backbone.
Yeah.
And that's about having a customer experience at the forefront of what you do. That's your highest priority. And I think the way that we've been able to do that, and you talk about the interactions we have with people, if you look at even how our marketing has moved over the last few years, we use real people. These are people that either currently live in our developments or live in the communities that we're about to develop in. And we genuinely care about how those people will live. We genuinely talk to them and say, how do you choose to live your life? Where do you spend time on weekends? Will this park actually be meaningful? Before we design it, thinking what we think we might want there, how would you use it?
Yeah.
How do you use this space? What do your kids do? How do they interact with the neighbour kids? And I think there's that element of that upfront design and quality piece. And then you've got prosperity, which is all around, basically remaining committed to our customers well after they've moved into their new homes. And I think if you look at a lot of what's driven that, it's just because we just genuinely have an interest and a real desire to give these people a life they can be proud of. That's the first principle. But if you look at it in a more cynical way, the reality is with life now, referrals and testimonials are everything to a business. For a business to be successful, you can't just talk about yourself and say to people, yes, we're successful. The reality is our success will be based on people saying to their friends and their families, you should deal with these people. We bought from Frasers Property, and it is the greatest decision we've made. That testimonial in the current world of trust and the way that's all set up, that people trust those referrals more than anything. We need our customers to be our biggest advocates. And that's not an inauthentic way of trying to approach that, because it is a mutual benefit, but it just means so much to us to see customers who talk about us the way, or even in an enlightened way, more than we'd even talk about ourselves.
Yeah. And I think this is the This is a thing that the corporate world's grappling with at the moment, and I think what you've said is just so right, which is that two things can be true at the same time. This is a great thing to do because it makes everybody realise that the business is doing meaningful work, but it also underpins business performance as well. And so the fact that both work hand in hand is a good thing.
Yeah, and there's no doubt you talk about the great people in our business, but there's no doubt that's the attachment.
Yeah.
You know, sure, people come to work for a variety of reasons, but I think if you have a true purpose and you can see that purpose actually having a meaningful influence on someone's life, there's nothing greater than that.
Well, that's great, and I think that's the perfect place to end. This, of course, will be out when the Live Proud campaign is also out in front of the eyes of Australians. So much of what Anthony's spoken about, hopefully you'll see in and around cities and on TV and cinema. This is a moment in time where Frasers is deciding to really tell the story. And so, Anthony, this has been a great way to get into it ourselves.
Well, thanks for taking the time. I've loved every minute of it.
Thank you.